In that American mansion, where luxury shone in every detail, the young maid spent hours preparing the most perfect dinner of her life. The candles were lit, the wine wafted from the glass, the aroma of the food seemed to bring to the table not only flavors, but also secret dreams she kept hidden. Each dish served as a hidden confession of love, each detail a hope that, for once, the millionaire would realize that behind the uniform lay a heart beating for him. But when the doors opened and footsteps echoed across the marble, what she saw stole her breath. He hadn't entered alone. Beside him, radiant in a shimmering gown, stood another woman, instantly occupying the place she had dreamed of. In a single instant, all the effort, all the affection, and all the hope transformed into a bitter silence that shattered her soul. The woman's soft laughter filled the room before the millionaire could even thank her for dinner. The maid, motionless, watched their hands touch on the table she had so carefully prepared, and felt the candles extinguish within her, as if her own light had been stolen. He didn't notice her presence, didn't see the pain hidden in the eyes that avoided meeting his. But fate, relentless, had already begun to move its pieces. That night, which seemed like just another silent humiliation, would become the beginning of an inevitable transformation. What began with invisible tears would end in poetic justice, for no one despises a true heart without karma taking its toll. And in that mansion, under the shadows of luxury, the turnaround awaited the right moment to blossom. If this story has touched you, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share your opinion in the comments. Night fell over the American city, and the Crawford mansion glowed like a golden beacon in the darkness. Inside, every detail was being prepared with almost sacred perfection. The maid, young and delicate-featured, moved silently between the dining room and the kitchen, as if carrying on her shoulders not only the responsibility of a dinner, but also the weight of a rapidly beating heart. She had dedicated the entire day to making that evening a memorable one. The linen tablecloth lay impeccably on the table, the cutlery glinted in the reflection of the candles, and the aroma of the carefully seasoned main course seemed to dance in the air like a promise. Everything was in its place. Everything reflected the care of someone who, even invisible, dreamed of being seen. To any outsider, it was nothing more than a simple dinner for the millionaire boss. But to her, it was so much more. Every chosen detail carried feelings that were never spoken, a love that grew silently and that she stifled each day so it wouldn't turn into sin. In the hours when the house rested in silence, it was in that very room that she secretly imagined what it would be like to be seen not as a maid, but as a woman. That night, he believed, perhaps fate would give her a chance. Perhaps upon entering and seeing the candles, the wine, and the prepared table, the millionaire would notice the difference in the air and realize there was more to her life than business and appearances. The grandfather clock chimed, marking the exact time he was expected to arrive. Her heart raced. She smoothed her hair, discreetly wiped her hands on her apron, and took a deep breath. Deep down, she knew she should never get her hopes up. But how could she stop hope from blossoming when every rose in the arrangement seemed to speak for her? The sound of tires on the gravel driveway echoed through the hall, announcing his arrival. Her chest tightened, and for a moment she believed this would be the moment the invisible would be seen. But fate, always cruel to those who dream in silence, had already prepared another scene. The door opened elegantly, and her boss's firm footsteps echoed on the marble. She looked up, ready to see only him, but the shock hit her like an icy blade. Beside her walked a stunning woman, wrapped in a shimmering dress, her striking perfume quickly filling the entire room. Her eyes, haughty and confident, immediately occupied the space, as if she had always owned the place. The waitress felt the blood drain from her face. The candles she had lit seemed to mock her naivety. The dishes she had arranged with such care now became the setting for a story that didn't include her. The millionaire smiled at his guest, pulled out her chair, and in that gesture, all the waitress's hopes were shattered. There were no words, only the heavy silence of someone who understands once and for all that silent love rarely finds an echo in the eyes of those it loves. And as she stood motionless, her hands hidden behind her apron so no one could see her trembling, something within her soul began to transform. It wasn't revenge, nor envy. It was the seed of a truth that time would make blossom. No one humiliates a sincere heart without fate returning every tear in the form of justice. The dinner the maid had so carefully prepared continued as if she didn't exist. The elegant and confident guest took her place at the table naturally, as if it had always been hers. The millionaire smiled at her, poured her wine, and leaned in to listen to every word as if it were the most important in the world. The maid, standing discreetly in the corner of the room, watched everything with a heavy heart, feeling like a forgotten shadow in the scene she herself had created. Every laugh exchanged between them was an invisible stab, every knowing look between the boss and his wife a cruel reminder that her efforts meant nothing. The guest, noticing his presence, gave him a look laden with superiority. It wasn't long before she uttered her first insult, disguised as a casual comment. "You have very dedicated employees, Ethan," she said, setting her wineglass on the table. "It's almost as if they're trying to impress someone." The millionaire laughed, not catching the venom behind his words, but the maid felt her blood boil. She smiled slightly, lowered her head, and pretended not to hear, but inside she fought back the tears that threatened to fall. Throughout dinner, she was called upon repeatedly, not just to serve, but to be reminded of her position. "More wine, please. Bring more napkins. Adjust the lighting, it's too bright." Each order was accompanied by a cold glare from the guest, as if her role were merely to reinforce the difference between them. The waitress obeyed silently, holding the tray tightly, trying to maintain her dignity amidst the humiliation. But when she heard the guest laugh out loud and say, in a cruel joke, "I can only imagine how sad it must be to serve a table that will never be yours," something inside her broke completely. The millionaire, distracted by his glamorous company, failed to notice the cruelty. He was enchanted, blinded by appearances, deaf to the suffering unfolding before his eyes. And the maid, even as she suffered, began to understand that her pain would not be forgotten by fate. The tears that remained unshed that night would become the seeds of an inevitable justice. After dinner, when everyone had left, the maid remained alone in the dining room. She blew out the candles, cleared the plates, and cleaned the glasses, which still bore the guests' lipstick marks. Each gesture was made with steady hands, but her heart was breaking inside. In the reflection of the glass, she saw her red eyes and realized that the woman there was no longer the same one who had lit the candles with hope. She was someone carrying a deep pain, but also a strength I had never known. In the small room where she slept, she lay down, exhausted, but unable to close her eyes. The guests' laughter echoed in her mind, and the image of the millionaire applauding her every word gnawed at her. But through her tears, she raised her eyes to the ceiling and whispered silently, "If no one sees my worth, may fate see it." And in that simple but sincere request, an invisible promise was sealed. The universe, never deaf to the pleas of sincere hearts, was already beginning to move its pieces. The woman who had triumphed with arrogance that night would soon taste the poison she carried, and the millionaire, blinded by his vanity, would be forced to see what had always been before him. The maid didn't know how or when, but she felt deep down that the tears she shed would be the foundation of an inevitable turnaround. The days that followed transformed the Crawford mansion into a silent stage of pain for the maid. The new woman's presence, now a constant presence, filled every corner of the house. She walked with the air of a woman of the place. Her voice echoed with rapid orders, and every gesture seemed carefully rehearsed to reassert who held the power. The maid, who had previously found refuge in routine, now felt the weight of every minute. The hallways that used to be mere passageways became traps of humiliation. The guest, known to everyone as Victoria, never missed a chance to belittle. She would loudly comment on the quality of the dishes, even when they were perfect. She complained about the cleanliness, even when the rooms were sparkling. Once, in front of other employees, she even held up a glass dismissively and said, "It's funny. Some people can strive their whole lives and still never amount to more than shadows." The comment fell like a sentence, and although it wasn't said by name, everyone knew who it was addressed to. Grace, the employee, lowered her head and swallowed the pain as if swallowing a bitter cup. Ethan, the millionaire, seemed blind. Enchanted by Victoria's beauty and charm, he didn't understand the venomous look she gave him when he wasn't around. His attention was focused on the business ventures she encouraged him to pursue, the glamorous dinners she organized, and the image of the perfect couple they presented to society. The invisible maid watched it all like someone silently watching a fire begin, knowing that sooner or later the flames would consume everything. Despite the pain, Grace began to notice small cracks in Victoria's mask of perfection. Behind her radiant smile, there were moments when arrogance slipped undisguised. One afternoon, when she entered the library to clean, the maid found her alone, talking on the phone in a low, harsh voice. "He'll sign soon, don't worry, I know exactly how to manipulate him. We only need a few more days." Noticing the young woman's presence, Victoria quickly composed herself, giving her an icy look that was enough to silence her. Grace said nothing, but committed every word to memory like someone collecting evidence of a crime. In the kitchen, the other employees also murmured among themselves. Many already suspected Victoria's intentions, but no one dared confront her. Grace remained silent, but within her grew the feeling that she wasn't wrong in believing that fate would bring answers. The universe seemed to send her subtle signs: a forgotten contract on the table with incoherent numbers, a crumpled note in Victoria's pocket, conversations interrupted when someone entered the room. Everything pointed to something greater than simple arrogance. There was self-interest, manipulation, and unbridled ambition. Amidst this turmoil, the maid continued her work with dignity. She cleaned the rooms, arranged the flowers, prepared the coffee. But every gesture, every silent glance was charged with an invisible force, as if she were secretly weaving the web of justice itself. Sometimes, as she passed the millionaire, their eyes would meet for a second. He said nothing, but there was an uneasiness in his eyes, as if he were beginning to sense something was amiss. In the solitude of her simple room, Grace reflected on everything she had witnessed. The humiliations still hurt, but they no longer destroyed her as before. It was as if, deep within her soul, a certainty had blossomed. No one builds power over contempt without the inevitable downfall. And she, silent as ever, would bear witness to the coming turning point. Victoria began to move around the mansion with the confidence of someone who believed she owned everything. And this inflamed certainty was reflected in the way she treated everyone around her, especially the maid. In the morning, she demanded pointless changes to the decor. In the afternoon, she changed entire menus minutes before dinner, and at night she invented flaws where only care had been needed. On one of these nights, she pointed to the flower arrangement Grace had prepared and, in front of 2 guests, gave a cold smile. "Beautiful. For a country house. Here we need something that matches figures, not souvenirs." The couple's suppressed laughter burned more than any shout. Grace collected the arrangement in silence, unaware that from the landing, Ethan had been observing. Everything for a moment too long to be mere coincidence. He descended without intervening, but something in his gaze no longer applauded the easy radiance. The unease he had tried to suppress for the past few weeks returned like a weight on his chest. Victoria's orders cut through the house like blades: change the curtains, dim the lights, double the staff on the weekend, serve more expensive champagne. It wasn't about taste, it was about dominance. And when a supplier delayed a delivery, she unlocked her phone in front of everyone, and in a sharp voice threatened to cancel contracts and sue the company. Grace, behind the kitchen counter, felt her spine shiver. The humiliation was no longer a whisper, it was a spectacle. Ethan tried to deflect the situation with a, "We'll sort it out tomorrow," but Victoria had already done what she wanted, to show she was in charge. Still, when the phone was hung up, he remained silent, staring at the wood of the table as if reading, in the veins of the oak, a sentence he didn't want to accept. In the middle of the following afternoon, a seemingly simple incident triggered the first real alarm. A rare wine disappeared from the cellar, and before anyone could breathe, Victoria pointed it out to Grace. It was probably poorly organized. Things disappear when you don't know how to take care of them. The young woman's face flushed, but she simply opened the control sheet, handwritten in the tiny handwriting that maintained the house's order. There were entries, exits, dates, names, nothing out of place. That's when the head of security, discreetly summoned by Ethan, reported that the pantry cameras had captured a new employee, brought in by Victoria, picking up boxes during the cellar's opening hours. Victoria laughed, dismissing the matter. A mistake, that's all. There was no scandal, no explicit accusation. There was, however, a new silence between Ethan and her, the kind that begins to separate two people like oceans. That night, during a dinner with investors, Victoria again insisted that he sign a letter of intent related to a venture on her brother's behalf. "It's an opportunity that won't come again," she whispered, so soft it sounded like caress, loud enough to hurt. Ethan asked to see the technical notes. Days earlier, he'd received an elegant dossier full of photos and promises. Now, however, he asked for audited reports. "Don't you trust me?" she replied, with a touch on the sleeve of the suit that, in other times, had the power to silence him. This time she didn't. He slowly removed his hand and said simply, "Trust doesn't fear documents." Ice ran across the table. Grace, serving the main course, felt the temperature in the room drop a few degrees, as if the air finally admitted something was wrong. From that day on, the small cracks began to paint a map of decline. A florist called to confirm an order Victoria had been charged twice. A driver complained awkwardly about conflicting instructions and cash fares. A decorator brought samples for the lady of the house, and when Grace explained there was no lady of the house, the man blushed, saying that was what he'd been told. Nothing in isolation was definitive, but together the signs formed a chorus Ethan could no longer ignore. At the end of a tense afternoon, he passed Grace in the library hallway. The tray she carried tremblingly betrayed the day. Ethan, lacking his former arrogance, simply held the door open for her. The gesture would have been trivial if he hadn't followed it with a thank you that felt like recognition. It was a thank you for opening the door, but also for holding up the house when everyone else pretended it wasn't shaking. Grace nodded, trying not to spill her guts. Her heart, which had learned to take it in silence, recognized in that single second a shift in the wind. And that night, when the lights dimmed and the mansion fell asleep to the distant hum of the city, Ethan remained in his office, staring at an antique photo frame of his father, a man of few words who had taught him, among so many things, the difference between value and price. Victoria knew how to name prices. Grace, with her notebooks and silence, taught value. The clock struck midnight when he closed the contract folder and decided he would wait one more move, just one more, to make a decision that would not be reversed. Fate, patient, had already set the pieces. And in the hallway where the perfume of the flowers Victoria had poured out to impress was beginning to fade, the scent that remained was that of the roses Grace always chose, discreet, firm, true, the only ones that didn't need a spotlight to exist. The next morning, the mansion awoke to a noise that came not from glasses and cutlery, but from papers. The house manager, pressed by unusual delays, brought Ethan a folder with conflicting invoices from suppliers, courtesies that were never requested, flowers that were charged twice, services billed under the names of departments that didn't exist. Grace, silent in the background, recognized numbers and dates because she was the one who wrote down each delivery in discreet notebooks. Without raising her voice, she pointed out the lines that didn't match what had come in through the back door. Ethan followed with his finger, line by line, and the expression of doubt that had been growing in him settled like a shadow. Victoria tried to stifle the discomfort with brilliance. He'd booked an intimate lunch at noon and demanded crystal glasses for 4, even though there were only 3. When one of them shattered with a sharp crack, the room held its breath, and she shot him a look like a hook. "Careful, Grace." But the head of security, who was discreetly adjusting a new camera in the hallway, warned him he would routinely review the footage. Hours later, when he brought the screen into the office, they saw a newly hired employee push the cart through the doorway and force the tray against the frame. There was no accusation, no scandal, only the thick silence that descends when the mask doesn't fall. It slowly peels away. Ethan began requesting audited reports on Victoria's brother's business venture. The corporate lawyer called from New York with a polite voice that spoke volumes. Shell companies, hidden liabilities, a labor dispute in Arizona that no one had mentioned. "There's reputational risk," he said, and the phrase lingered in Ethan's ear long after the call ended. That afternoon, from the top of the stairs, he watched Victoria scold the gardener who had worked on the property since her father's time over a flower bed she wanted to bloom within a week. Grace descended the steps and, without confrontation, stood beside the old man, offering water and sharing the weight of the pot. The gesture was small, the symbol immense. When a summer storm knocked out the power just before a dinner with 2 investors, Victoria lost control. She ran back and forth, asking where the flashlights were, who had the generator key, why the house wasn't prepared for unexpected situations. Grace disappeared for 10 minutes and returned with tall candles, set at different heights, transforming the room into a scene that seemed designed. Warm shadows on the wood paneling, soft reflections on the silver, the aroma of the main course enhanced by the machine-free silence. The investors smiled, surprised by the unexpected coziness. Ethan, who had always believed that power was synonymous with full light, realized for the first time how harmony arises from the invisible. Victoria noticed the gleam that wasn't hers and gritted her teeth behind her smile. In the early hours of the morning, she tried to access Ethan's laptop to get a head start on answers, as she later put it. Grace, passing by with a tea tray, saw the lid half open in the empty office and, instinctively, gently closed it, leaving only a nearly silent note on the leather desk. "Be careful. What shines when the lights go out?" The next day, Ethan ran a silly experiment. He renamed a document and rearranged the order of the files. That night, he found access notifications that weren't his, and the echo of the note landed where suspicion already nestled. The house began to choose sides the only way houses do, through gestures. The waitress began bringing Grace coffee the minutes Victoria left the hall. The driver waited an extra 2 minutes to ensure the young woman crossed the garden. Without rain. The security guard turned a blind eye when she took a bowl of soup to the gardener late one night. No one conspired. No one conspired. They simply recognized the weight that kept them standing when the screams tried to fall over their heads. One Friday afternoon, an arrangement of white roses Victoria had ordered for the library arrived with buds still closed. She snapped her fingers, ordering them to open by sunset. Grace took the roses into the warm light of the lobby and patiently loosened the ribbons, trimmed the stems slightly, and gave them space and fresh water. By daybreak, half the flowers had bloomed on their own. Victoria entered, ran her hand over the petals without looking at anyone, and as she raised her glass to toast herself, a drop of red wine ran down the stem and splashed her pale dress. Just a single spot, but in the exact spot where the late afternoon light would hit. She bit back a curse, bit back a smile, and left, dragging her own nerves behind her. Grace picked up the crooked glass and straightened it like someone putting a destiny back on track. As dusk fell, Ethan parked the SUV in the garage and stood for a few seconds in the dark, his hand poised on the key. Inside the house, he could hear the rumble of conversations and the clash of cutlery, but what echoed was a recent repertoire of small truths: the broken glass and the camera, the lawyer's report, the old gardener propped up, the dinner saved by candles, the document tampered with without permission. When he entered, he passed Victoria, perfumed as if the world were a stage always ready for her, and Grace returning from the pantry with a clean apron and tired eyes that didn't ask for applause. He said nothing to either of them. He simply realized that he was, at last, standing on the line that separates what dazzles from what illuminates, and so he decided to wait for just one more sign, the final one, before breaking the spell for good, as if fate had heard. A gust of wind blew open the balcony door and scattered a trail of petals across the floor. Amidst the scattered red and the cold marble, a single rose stood untouched in its vase, while all the others danced on the floor. Ethan stopped before it and smiled mirthlessly. Not every sparkle can withstand the first wind. That which has roots can. And for some reason he no longer needed to name. He knew exactly who, in that house, was the root. Victoria began to feel the mansion slipping through her fingers like fine sand. Before her, every word had sounded like an unquestionable command, but now she noticed sidelong glances, silences that showed no reverence, small delays that betrayed a lack of zeal. It was as if the house, alive in its essence, had chosen to no longer obey blindly. This discomfort only fueled her fury. She began to take it out on Grace even more, as if humiliating the young woman could restore her sense of dominance. "You're too slow," she would say as she watched her set the already set table. "Learn to smile even when you have no reason to," she would snap in front of guests. Each sentence was a silent blow, but one that no longer met with the same resistance from Grace. The young woman had learned to transform every pain into firm silence, into a dignity that Victoria could not shake. As the new improvised lady of the house raised her voice, Ethan became increasingly attentive. He no longer laughed at her jokes, no longer let himself be seduced by her studied glances. He spent long minutes in silence, studying the reports that arrived, analyzing the repeated errors, remembering the evidence he had accumulated. By then, he no longer needed confirmation. He simply waited for the right moment to pull the thread that would dismantle the entire charade. One afternoon, the contrast became even clearer. Victoria had arranged a cocktail party for a group of influential friends, but in the middle of the event, she erupted in fury because the flowers weren't the exact color she'd requested. The room froze at her outburst, and everyone waited for Ethan's reaction. But it was Grace who quietly appeared with arrangements of discreet roses she grew in the backyard garden. She placed them in vases without fanfare, and suddenly the room felt more welcoming, less oppressive. The guests praised her sensitivity of simple touch, unsure of who was responsible. Victoria bit her lip, sensing the invisible threat that radiated from the maid's every gesture. That night, alone in her room, Grace reflected on the strange strength life gave her. She didn't seek recognition, she didn't seek advancement, but she had learned that her silent truth was stronger than any jewel. While Victoria drowned in luxury and tried to mold the world to her vanity, Grace simply continued, firm, like a root in deep soil. Ethan, in his office, opened the drawer and found the note she had left days before. "Be careful what shines when the lights go." Out! He read it over and over, feeling that those few words summed it all up. He himself had been seduced by the glitter, but now, in the quiet of the early morning hours, he understood the value of that which remained standing when all else fell. Victoria, unaware that her fate was already sealed, planned her next move. She gathered paperwork, made secret calls, and arranged meetings with dubious investors. But her haste led her to stumble into increasingly obvious mistakes. The millionaire, who had previously seen her as the key to success, now saw her only as a risk. And Grace, invisible to society, became the living reflection of what Victoria could never be. Truth. Fate, ever patient, was already sharpening its blades. And as always happens when arrogance crosses its limits, the downfall was near. The mansion that once seemed a stage for artificial triumphs would soon become the setting for the most silent and ruthless justice. And in the midst of it all, the young maid, who had scattered roses and tears, was about to see the universe return in the form of karma, every humiliation she had suffered. Their first public fall came at an event Victoria vowed to transform into their showcase. It was a fundraising dinner on the glass-enclosed terrace of a Manhattan museum, the city awash in lights under a clear sky that seemed made for selfies and headlines. She arrived meticulously made up, clutching Ethan's arm like a trophy. Protocol was going smoothly until the non-negotiable requests began to pile up. Change the music to something less dated. Move the flowers to the photogenic quadrant. Bring a vintage champagne not included in the contract. When the maitre d' explained in a low voice that there was no way to arrange it in minutes, Victoria smiled at the guests and, still smiling, publicly sniped, "If you had a team like mine, it would be sorted already." The waiter blushed. The comment landed heavily on the tables. Ethan pretended not to hear, but his jaw formed the first crease of the evening. When it was time for the speeches, She took the microphone without being scheduled. She spoke of vision, of courage to take risks, and without naming names, promised that new partnerships would triple philanthropic investments. One of the patrons, Ethan's longtime partner, raised his glass and asked, in the neutral tone of someone familiar with financial statements, where the tripling would come from. Before she could form a response, an aide sent Ethan via cell phone an image of an email forwarded from her own laptop to an anonymous address, with attachments that shouldn't leave the office. His heart sank. Outside the glass, a sudden wind blew, vibrating the light panel illuminating the stage. A glass hit the wrong edge and fell, shattering under Victoria's heels just as she said, "Trust." The sharp sound cut through the room like a sentence. Grace was there, invisible as always, temporarily hired by the buffet staff as backup, discreetly picking up shards and hurriedly serving water before anyone cut themselves. No one noticed her as she covered the hands of a young waiter with a napkin as he tried to sweep up the splinters. Ethan noticed. From the head table, his eyes followed the small gesture that restored dignity to what arrogance had exposed. The worst, however, was yet to come. In the reserved area, Victoria was arguing in whispers with the museum director for having cut off her microphone after the glass had exploded. The whisper, captured by a still-live lapel microphone, leaked into the internal system for a few eternal seconds. "These people are eating out of our hands. Just keep the sparkle going and they'll applaud." There was a brief silence, the kind you recognize at expensive dinners. It was no longer a rumor, it was registered disdain. Ethan's press secretary approached, pale, whispering the word he'd dreaded hearing ever since the precious sparkle began to dazzle rather than illuminate crisis. As she left, Victoria tried to piece together her narrative. She smiled for the guests' cameras, said that unexpected things happen, and put her arm through Ethan's, waiting for the flash. He didn't offer his shoulder. He made room, and for the first time asked the driver to open the door not for her, but for an elderly woman from the council, the same one Victoria had ignored hours before. In the SUV, with the tinted windows shutting out the city, her mask fell completely. "You exposed me to everyone," she snapped, her voice sharp. Ethan took a deep breath. "Me?" and slid the phone onto her lap. The email capture, the log of the late-night access, the sentence that had leaked over the living room sound system. Victoria blinked slowly, as if measuring escape routes. She chose the worst option. "If you didn't have a house run by simpletons, I wouldn't have to improvise all the time." The word simpleton burned in Ethan like alcohol on an open wound. He saw, in that syllable, the gardener being shamed on the stairs, the kitchen maid swallowing orders, Grace holding injured fingers without asking for credit. He saw, above all, his own cowardice. For so long he had called efficiency what was only veneered contempt. The next day the consequences arrived before breakfast. The museum demanded a formal retraction for the recorded speech, patrons suggested lowering her profile for a few weeks, and an investor demanded by clause that Victoria not attend meetings. She paced the hall, searching for control like someone turning doorknobs in someone else's house. She found none. The administrator brought a new file with disagreements. The legal department requested full access to the contracts she so passionately defended. The press wanted a position. Amidst the whirlwind, Grace crossed the hall with the tray of cups. No one noticed, except Ethan. When the china clinked, he knew the line had been crossed. At dusk, he found her in the pantry, balancing dishes with the care of someone who carries little and therefore knows the weight of each object. "Thank you for yesterday," she said simply, and that was enough to tie an invisible thread together. She replied that she only did what she had to, and the phrase, so common in Grace's mouth, sounded extraordinary to someone who had spent months surrounded by people who only did what was convenient. Victoria, wounded, decided to appeal to the audience she still thought she commanded. She posted an old photo on social media, her arm around Ethan with a caption about resilient partnerships. Legal asked for it to be taken down. The museum shared a statement about ethics and respect. The comments were unforgiving. For the first time since he'd let her in, Ethan felt firsthand the reputational cost of confusing brilliance with value. And then he realized the next conversation wouldn't be about events or contracts, but about character. The city's air had already shifted. Inside, it was time to change the locks. The days after the dinner scandal were a silent whirlwind. The mansion, which had once vibrated with rehearsed laughter and expensive perfume, was now filled with an air of tension that weighed more heavily than any spoken word. Victoria paced back and forth, speaking softly into the phone, as if trying to hold back a dam about to burst. But each call she made ended in frustration. Investors hung up more quickly. Invitations were withdrawn. Meetings cancelled. The inevitable downfall had begun. Ethan, for his part, became increasingly distant. He didn't raise his voice, didn't accuse her directly, but his silence was harsher than any confrontation. He spent hours in his office, reviewing documents, closing folders he'd previously entrusted to her, and locking everything away. What Victoria interpreted as caution was actually the beginning of his detachment. Grace, always discreet, noticed every gesture. She saw her boss as more serious, but she also noticed that his eyes, when they met her in the hallways, no longer held the same blindness as before. There was recognition, perhaps even regret, and that in itself showed that destiny was in motion. Victoria, feeling cornered, decided to confront Ethan head-on. One night she walked into his office without knocking, holding a folder of contracts she had manipulated. "You need to sign this now," she said, trying to assert herself. Ethan slowly looked up, closed the folder in front of her, and replied, "I'm not signing anything without an independent audit." The words fell like a hammer. Victoria's face contorted, her sweet tone crumbled, and for the first time she let out the raw fury she'd been hiding. "You would never have gotten where you are without me. You're just a lost rich kid, and without me you'll lose everything." Ethan remained silent, simply sliding a series of reports and screenshots of the recordings that proved his manipulations to the center of the desk. The blood drained from her face. The scene was unwittingly witnessed by Grace, who was carrying tea on a tray and stood motionless in the half-open doorway. She didn't hear every word, but she saw enough. Victoria's arrogance crumbling, and Ethan's firmness finally rising. She retreated silently, but deep within her she felt something blossom. Not joy at another's misfortune, but the relief of seeing justice begin to be served. The next morning, Ethan made a decision. He gathered the management team and the lawyers, and in front of Victoria announced that she was officially stepping down from any role in his business. The shock was palpable. She tried to protest, to raise her voice, but no one supported her. Even the employees who had endured humiliation for months stood firm, not moving to help her. It was as if the entire house, united, had chosen to face the truth at the same time. Victoria walked out the mansion's main door like a dethroned queen, still trying to maintain her composure. But at the gate, in front of the reporters already waiting for her, she lost control. The cameras captured her anger, her harsh words, her broken mask, and the next day, the newspapers spoke not of glamour or power, but of deceit, manipulation, and downfall. The brilliance she so steadfastly defended now illuminated only her defeat. Grace watched from afar in the hallway, her hands trembling. There was no smile on her face, only a profound silence. She knew fate had fulfilled its part, that karma had delivered its answer. But she also knew this was only the beginning of a new phase. Ethan, sitting in his armchair after the storm, stared into space for long minutes. In his pocket, he still kept the note she'd left him weeks ago. And in that small piece of paper, he found more truth than in all the promises Victoria had made. The weight of the mansion seemed lighter, and for the first time in a long time, the millionaire realized that wealth lay not in the glitter it displayed, but in the simplicity that remained standing when everything around it crumbled. Karma had been partially fulfilled, but life still had the greatest twist in store. The house breathed differently the next day. There was no longer the hurried leap across the marble, nor the orders thrown like blades. The silence that remained was not empty, but restful. The servants walked with lighter steps, as if recovering after a fright too long. Grace woke before the sun, prepared the staffs. Coffee, reviewed the inventory notes, checked the flowers, the linens, the dishes, everything she always did, but now without the weight of her diminishing gaze. The mansion seemed to thank her in small ways. The door that didn't creak, the garden that opened, the clean light that streamed in. Ethan spent the morning calling lawyers and partners. The scandal was already circulating on financial websites and in society columns, and he had to choose between hiding or taking responsibility. He chose the latter. He drafted a short, adjective-free note, publicly apologizing for what had happened at the museum and agreeing that his legal cases would be reviewed. When he finished, he didn't press send. He got up, opened the window, and stood staring at the dew-soaked lawn. Grace's note, folded, frayed at the edges, was in his pocket. When he returned to the table, he fit in the final sentence. "From this day forward, I choose what remains when the lights go out." He sent it. That afternoon, a brown box arrived with no fancy return address, just the worn postmark of a neighborhood florist. Inside were short-stemmed, simple roses, smelling of a garden, not perfume. The card read, "For the house to breathe again." The administrator couldn't explain who sent it. Grace smiled at the corner of her eye, as if recognizing the writings of life. She distributed the vases throughout the hall, the library, the pantry. Ethan came down the stairs while she arranged one of the flowers in the hydrangea. He stopped to step back as if not wanting to get in the way and asked if she needed help. She said it was fine, but handed him a pair of scissors to trim the crooked stem. He accepted, and for seconds they worked side by side, silent, as if learning to trim the excess was also part of settling accounts with the world. The phone rang relentlessly. The museum accepted the retraction. A long-time skeptical investor offered a final conversation. The elderly counselor, the same one Ethan had, opened the door to that night, called to say that important houses don't fall when they have roots. After hanging up, he stood for a moment with the expression of someone who doesn't want to forget the timbre of that phrase. Crossing the kitchen, he found Grace labeling jars in a calm, round hand. He asked, almost without understanding, how she organized so much without making a mistake. "I write down what no one sees, sir," he said, without grandiosity. This pierced him. He realized that for years he had confused efficiency with brilliance, and that, in truth, the house had always been sustained by those who write down what no one sees. There were setbacks. A famous blogger tried to spin the story into a pulp novel, and the comments were vicious. A supplier threatened to cancel a contract for fear of headlines. Grace didn't read anything, but she heard from the whispers. Instead of hiding, she prepared a simple dinner for the team. A pot of hot soup, bread on the large table in the kitchen, people in uniforms chuckling softly. Ethan appeared at the door unannounced. The scene wasn't meant for him, but it lingered. He thanked everyone one by one, calling them by name. When he reached Grace, he simply nodded. She returned the gesture and went back to cutting the bread. At the end of the week, there would be a crucial meeting with two partners who might or might not be running a major fund. The mansion's conference room was discreetly improvised, nothing ostentatious. Grace went in first, opened the windows, adjusted the light so it wouldn't shine on the screens, placed a pitcher of water with lemon slices, distributed folders, and checked the pens. She noticed 2 attachments were missing and ran to the office to get the correct copies. They were reports Ethan had reorganized the day before. When the partners arrived, everything was in place, and the meeting began quietly. Midway through the conversation, the power flickered for a few seconds. The blinds slammed, the light flickered, and no one moved. The candles Grace had discreetly left on the tray as a precaution were lit by Ethan without attracting attention, and the meeting continued. At the end, the handshake followed with the words, "We're staying. What matters is here." That evening, when the house finally quieted down, the gardener appeared on the porch with a yellowed envelope. It contained neither a bill nor an invitation. It contained old photos of Ethan's father inaugurating the greenhouse, with Grace as a child in a corner of the portrait, holding the hand of her mother, who had worked there summers. The old man had kept the photo, unaware that one day it would become a key element. Ethan held it between his fingers, feeling the weight of a story that begins not when the money arrives, but when someone is willing to care for it. He sought Grace out, found her in the library, arranging the spines by color and height. He showed her the photo. She blushed, said she didn't remember. That afternoon, but smiled with a gratitude that needed no words. That was the day the narrative shifted completely. It wasn't just about Victoria's downfall anymore, but about what had survived it. Firmer processes, respectful relationships, the silent gesture that saves meetings and calms hallways. Ethan began arriving early in the kitchen, drinking his first coffee there, overhearing snippets of conversation, learning about the driver's ankle, the pain in the waitress's arm, the flower bed. Burned by the ice. It wasn't an act, it was relearning. Grace, for her part, didn't change her routine to fit anyone's eyes. She continued doing what she always did, with the same small handwriting in her notebooks, the same patience with the roses, the same attention to the cracks through which chaos often enters. Sometimes, when they passed in the hallway, their eyes met for a longer moment, not out of promise, but out of recognition. The mansion, once a stage for masquerades, finally felt like a home. And fate, content with putting the pieces back together, saved the final act of justice for later, the one that silently seals each person's place. The proof of the past arrived one grey morning, inside a file box bearing the stamp of a Boston office and the sweet smell of old paper. The messenger said only that it was from the lawyer who had handled the family's affairs during Ethan's father's years. Inside, besides faded photos of the greenhouse and the first winter dance at the mansion, was an envelope sealed in Richard Crawford's firm handwriting. "To my son, when he needs to remember what holds a house together." Ethan read it standing, leaning against the library bench, as if listening to the voice of a benevolent ghost. The text was straightforward. It recounted the night a pantry worker, Anna Ellis, alerted him to a gas leak and, without a second thought, opened doors, summoned help, and saved more than just wood and marble. She saved people. His father wrote that. From that day on, he had decided to create a fund to train the children of his employees in areas that would help them grow. Administration, hospitality, accounting. A way for the house to thank those who kept it afloat. The fund never got off the ground because illness took it first. At the end, a passage that wounded and healed at the same time. If you ever forget the difference between price and value, look for the Ellis family. They'll be able to show you. Ethan stood still. Ellis. The surname he'd heard so often whispered in inventory notebooks, in the shy signature on receipts, Grace Ellis. That same day, the most obstinate partner scheduled a video meeting and brought the silk-wrapped knife. To preserve the fund that fueled part of the business, it would be prudent to rationalize the domestic structure, sell the greenhouse and outsource the team. It was a test disguised as advice, quick cash in exchange for uprooted roots. Ethan closed his laptop without responding. He went down to the greenhouse, still damp with morning dew, and strolled among the shelves where herbs and roses, tended by anonymous hands, sprouted. The gardener looked up, and as if sensing the turmoil, pointed to an antique iron pot inherited from his father. "This one can withstand winter because it's heavy on the ground." The sentence slammed into Ethan's ribs like a truth too simple to ignore. That afternoon, he called the administrator and the legal team and asked the team to gather in the pantry, that area where luxury had always been merely a backdrop to the real work. The long table was set with cups and still warm bread. Grace, surprised, remained standing, holding a dish towel as if needing something to hold on to. Ethan, without speaking, placed his father's envelope in the center and read excerpts of what he had just discovered. He didn't say her name until the end, when he looked up and said simply, "Ellis." The silence that followed was a restrained embrace. Grace took a shallow breath, her hand tightening on the cloth, and only then realized she was trembling. Ethan explained that he would reinstate, for real, with deed and endowment, the fund his father had intended to create, starting with a hospitality management scholarship in partnership with a New York school. He looked at Grace as if asking permission to correct a mistake, and added that the greenhouse and the cottage next door would not be sold, would henceforth be protected assets of the house, And that she would have the key to the cottage to use as a studio and work retreat. The key, heavy and ancient, jingled against the wood before coming to rest within her reach. Grace tried to back away, as she always did when life shone light in her face. She said she didn't need it, that she'd already learned to live in the invisible. But the house itself seemed to respond for Ethan. The smell of bread, the steam from the coffee, the roses blooming in the vase. He didn't make grandiose promises. Didn't ask for forgiveness with fancy words. He simply said, "I want to honor what keeps us going, and that doesn't outsource." The administrator nodded with the twisted emotion of someone who's seen many owners and few roots. The practical legal expert asked if he should immediately register the changes. "Today," Ethan replied, and in that adverb was the last closed door to the past that nearly swallowed him. At the end of the day, the partner returned to the work with the spreadsheets and investment. Protection clauses. Ethan listened, and when the condition of selling the greenhouse appeared again, he responded with the calm of someone who had finally learned to remember. "If that's the price, I'll lose the money." On the other side of the screen, the silence was first one of astonishment, then of calculation, and finally of respect, the kind of respect that can't be bought. The call dropped, and the house seemed to release the air it had held for months. Grace walked out into the garden, carrying the cold key in her apron pocket, walking slowly as if testing the ground before trusting. As she passed under the pergola, a late rose bloomed, defying the calendar. She smiled to herself, a tiny smile, and leaned her forehead against the warm wood of the late afternoon. It wasn't victory or romance. It was the silent rewriting of destiny. The man who mistook brilliance for value had finally chosen what remains when the light fades. And that choice would inevitably lead to others, including one that would bring him closer, not out of pity but out of recognition, to the woman who had once prepared the perfect dinner and watched, silent, as the paper tore before his eyes. Calmer, patient, tightened the remaining knot. There was still a long way to go, but the direction for once was right. News about Victoria no longer appeared in society columns, but in short courtroom blurbs and financial blogs. Each appearance was a reminder of her downfall, a breach of contract, lawsuit in Miami, a legal charge in Boston, a poorly explained trip to Las Vegas. The name that once graced front pages was now whispered as an example of how vanity can corrode empires. Ethan read the headlines with a mixture of relief and shame. Relief because he was no longer trapped by her. Shame because for so long he had allowed this mask to guide his life. Beside his computer screen, however, Grace's note remained folded, silent as a compass. In the mansion, routine returned to its natural rhythm. The hallways no longer echoed with shouts but with rhythmic footsteps. The servants chatted fearlessly. Quiet laughter once again filled the pantry, and even the gardener seemed to hum as he tended the greenhouse. Grace remained true to her essence. She took care of the invisible details, kept track of inventory in her notebook, and organized events without her name being mentioned. But increasingly, the house recognized the value that came from her presence. The housekeeper said that, "When Grace is around, nothing goes wrong." The driver commented that, "The house feels different when she smiles, even when tired." Ethan, even without speaking, absorbed each of these perceptions. It was during a meeting with investors, now scheduled inside the mansion itself, that the truth was revealed in symbolic fashion. The power suddenly failed, as it had weeks before. Victoria would have freaked out, screamed at her incompetence, and made a spectacle of the outage. But Grace, silently, had already lined up candles in discreet holders, anticipating that the generator still needed maintenance. All it took was a flick of a match, and the room was enveloped in a soft light that, instead of disturbing, made the meeting more intimate and welcoming. One of the investors commented that the atmosphere made him more confident in the seriousness of the meeting. Ethan said nothing, but glanced at Grace, who was discreetly walking away, and knew it was she who had once again saved the moment. That night, when everyone was asleep, he walked into the pantry and found her jotting something down in her notebook. "Do you always foresee what might go wrong?" he asked almost curiously. Grace looked up, hesitated, and replied, "I've learned to write down what no one sees, sir. Sometimes that's what keeps everything going." The simplicity of her answer struck Ethan like a revelation. There was no arrogance, no desire for recognition, just truth. He didn't respond, just nodded and left, but he took with him the certainty that that sentence would stick with him. Meanwhile, Victoria, in her unstoppable decline, tried to regain her footing at smaller events. But every door she knocked revealed the same response: distrust. A leaked video of one of her arguments with a former business partner went viral, and public opinion decreed her doom. The woman who once seemed untouchable was now seen as an opportunist, and the glamour she used as a shield had become a burden. Karma, which seemed slow, finally arrived like a tidal wave. At the mansion, Ethan gathered the employees and formally announced the creation of a fund in his father's honor, now registered with the notary public, with scholarships and programs for employees' families. Grace tried to hide in the back of the room, but he made a point of telling her that the idea had come from a simple gesture, a phrase written on a note that helped him see. The applause that echoed wasn't of flattery, but of genuine gratitude. Grace blushed, lowered her eyes and clutched the notebook to her chest as if she wanted to disappear. But in that moment, everyone knew she was no longer invisible. Ethan, upon retiring, looked at his father's portrait in the library and whispered, "I've learned." For the first time in a long time, he slept weightlessly, knowing that fate, though harsh, had shown him the value of what truly matters. Karma had been fulfilled in Victoria, but it still held one last symbolic twist to definitively close the story. The final test came disguised as routine. It was a stormy night, the same light rain that sometimes made the city feel like an old movie. The mansion was nearly silent when the light flickered twice and the generator started up with a strange, harsher-than-usual hum. Grace, apron already folded, crossed the pantry to check the windows when she noticed a subtle metallic smell that didn't match anything she'd cooked on the stove. She stopped, took another breath, and the premonition stung like an inherited memory. He descended the side stairs toward the basement where the generator panel was, and in the cement hallway the odor grew stronger. It wasn't fear, it was lucidity. She opened the small window, waved to the security guard, and asked him to shut off the main line while she went around the other side to check the valves. He hesitated, but her eyes didn't ask for permission, they asked for time. Within minutes, the employees were herded out. Onto the porch in the rain, cups forgotten, napkins still warm. Grace went back upstairs to notify Ethan and found him in his office, phone pressed to his chin, eyebrows furrowed by a news story that had just arrived. A story due out at dawn, insinuating that a close employee had facilitated Victoria's access to sensitive documents. At the bottom of the email, an attachment showed expenses in the name of G. Ellis. The storm was blowing in from the outside. She spoke before the shock turned to panic. She explained in a low voice that there was a risk in the basement, that the generator appeared to have been tampered with, and that the house needed to breathe. Ethan, starting from the same point that had always condemned him, almost asked why her name was on the papers. Almost. The almost hung between them, the rain beating against the glass. He pocketed his phone, stood, and followed her instructions without argument. As they passed the library, a memory emerged complete. His father's. Letter Anna Ellis's name, and the leak that saved the house decades before. The lines of past and present touched like recognizable threads. In the basement, the security chief was already waiting, sweating, pointing to the valve. The metal gave way with a snap, the generator's roar died in half a second, and the hallway sucked in cold air like an animal breathing again. The danger passed from the point of explosion to the thin belt of caution. In the courtyard, under the eaves, the team shivered more from fear than from the cold. Ethan checked them one by one, calling names he'd learned to respect over the past few weeks. When everything seemed back on track, his cell phone vibrated again. The journalist was asking for a position. The more pragmatic investor had left a message proposing to stop the damage by suspending the newly created fund and professionalizing internal management with an outsourced company immune to emotional ties. The attachment, initialed G. Ellis, sent from a disposable domain, was the perfect bait for an indecisive owner. Grace, in the corner, clutched the dish towel between her fingers, having learned that those with little need something concrete to hold on to when the winds blow hardest. He could ask everyone to get back to work and let the lawyer sort it out. He could keep quiet until dawn. But he stood still, the rain fading to a drizzle, and said without raising his voice that there would be no suspension of anything, that the fund existed to honor those who keep the house standing, and that emotional ties don't impede professionalism, they impede inhumanity. He sent the message in writing to the investor and to the journalist. He responded with a line that couldn't be read twice. No one on the internal team facilitated any crime, and full cooperation with the auditors and the police was ongoing. It was a simple sentence, but where it came from, it was an oath. As dawn approached, the fire department arrived to check the basement. The experienced captain examined the marks on the floor and the freshly cut plastic tape on one of the locks and was categorical. Someone had tampered with the system. The preliminary report noted outside interference, and internal cameras showed hours later a hooded figure wearing the badge of an employee Victoria had previously appointed. The expenses in G. Ellis's name, sent to the reporter, were crude copies of old requisitions with altered dates and initials. The handwriting wasn't hers. The paper was. The poison wasn't in the contents but in the timing of the shot. At breakfast, with the team still reeling, Ethan entered the pantry carrying 2 thermoses. He poured the cups himself, and when he reached Grace, he offered no excuses, only the acknowledgement of someone who made a decision with the house in hand. Thank you for yesterday. Thank you for now. She nodded, and the world, which sometimes demands speeches, needed only 2 clear words at that moment. Later, the Internal Audit Department sent its preliminary report. No evidence of misconduct linked to Grace, clear signs of sabotage associated with hiring made during the period when Victoria was operating independently. The journalist, informed of the firefighters' report, backed off the insinuation. The article was shorter, like someone apologizing without writing the word. At night, the mansion reeked of damp wood and baking bread. The generator, undergoing maintenance, would be replaced by new. Equipment and security would be reinforced with protocols born not of fear, but of learning. Grace passed by the greenhouse before closing for the day. She found a rosebud nearly opening on the stem she had saved from the cold. She stared at the contained red, remembering that not every flower needs a spotlight. It needs roots. In the library, Ethan took the last page from his father's envelope and pinned it to the back of the photo frame. Search for the Ellis family. Not as a password, but as a guide. The test finally was over, and what came next would no longer be pushed by crisis but pulled by choice. Fate, satisfied, arranged the chairs around the head table as if preparing a stage for the final scene. The house was ready for the turnaround that doesn't scream, the one that puts everything back in its place without having to tear anyone down forever, just showing in clear light who always held the roof up when the storm wanted to tear it off. Winter finally gave way to a timid spring. The Crawford mansion, which months before had breathed tension and vanity, now bloomed in silence, as if even the walls had learned to be grateful for the peace that had returned to the hallways. Victoria's scandalous downfall was no longer headline news. It had become merely an example repeated at discreet dinners of how rootless brilliance cannot withstand the wind. The city forgot her. Investors walked away, and she disappeared amid lawsuits and debts. It was the natural cycle. Destiny does not take revenge, only repays. In the house, routines returned to a serene rhythm. The servants chuckled in the pantry, the gardener tended the roses as if they were part of the family's soul, and even the hallways seemed wider, as if the weight of arrogance had been lifted. Grace continued as always, completing each task without expecting applause, writing in her notebook with the small handwriting that upheld the order of the invisible. But something inside her had changed. She no longer walked with her head down, not because she sought recognition, but because she had learned that dignity doesn't need to be hidden. Ethan, for his part, was different. He was no longer the man fascinated by lights, easy laughter, and expensive appearances. He had become quieter, more attentive, more human. He learned to listen to his team, to know each employee's name, to appreciate the small gestures that previously went unnoticed. The scars of the scandal were still there, but they were vivid reminders of what is lost when one trades roots for brilliance. And above all, there was a quiet gratitude in him that grew every time he passed Grace in the hallways. The fund created in honor of his father was officially launched in a simple ceremony inside the very greenhouse the family had nearly lost. There were no grand speeches or invitations to the press, just employees, partners, and the team that supported the house. Ethan read aloud the excerpt from his father's letter, the one, about Anna Ellis and the night a simple gesture saved lives. He then announced that the first scholarship would be awarded to the Ellis family. Grace, motionless in the back of the room, almost dropped the notebook from her hands. Her heart raced, but she kept her eyes downcast, as always. Ethan, however, urged her closer. He handed her an antique key, the one to the cottage next to the greenhouse, and said firmly, "Your family supported this house before I even understood its value. Now it's time for the house to support you." The silence was broken by heartfelt applause, not of flattery, but of recognition. Grace received the key with trembling hands, unable to hold back the tears that streamed down her face. It wasn't a gift. It wasn't charity. It was justice. It was fate returning, petal by petal, every tear she had silently shed. That night, the mansion felt lighter than ever. Ethan walked alone through the gardens, breathing in the scent of newly bloomed roses. In his pocket, he still kept her note. "Be careful what shines when the lights go out." He read it again and smiled, not with superficial joy, but with someone who finally understood what his father wanted to teach. He looked at the cottage next to the greenhouse and saw a soft light come on in the window. Grace was inside organizing the space that would now be hers, not to show off, not to shine, but to cultivate. He understood that the house's greatest wealth lay not in its marble, but in its enduring simplicity. Karma had done its part. Victoria reaped what she sowed, empty ambition, inevitable downfall. Grace, in contrast, reaped dignity, recognition, and the chance to live without hiding. And Ethan, marked by mistakes and pain, found redemption not in promises, but in choices, choosing value over price, root over shine, truth over appearances. The following spring, when the gardens were filled with flowers, the mansion was no longer the scene of humiliation, but of stories that blossomed in silence. And among them there was one that would always be remembered, that of the maid who prepared the perfect dinner for the millionaire, only to see another take her place that night. Fate, however, did not allow this pain to be the end. It transformed tears into justice, invisibility into strength, and silence into victory. Thus, without grandiose speeches, without trophies, without headlines, justice was served. Because karma doesn't need applause, it simply returns, in due time, to each person the exact weight of their choices. And in that American mansion, the roses that had once been a sign of pain now bloomed as a symbol of dignity. If this story touched you, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments what you would do in her place. See you next time.